None of this is going to happen without leadership. Darrell Steinberg provided incredible leadership that we have not been able to find anywhere else in the country when it comes to the commitment of dollars for these causes. And Darrell Steinberg, thank you for your leadership. You've set an example not only here for California, but across the country. Congressman Tony Coelho, who without Tony Coelho, our country would not have the Americans with Disability Act. Give a round of applause to Tony Coelho. I am honored to be here. John gave me that really nice introduction. I often say when they acknowledge that I am the leader of mental health and addiction nationally, that should tell you how bad off we really are as a nation. So the reason I am the leader is really by default. It's because no other member of Congress, when I was elected, this was after Tony had left, would want to put their name first on a bill with mental health and addiction on it. So I come from the smallest state in the country, Rhode Island. And I was the youngest member of Congress when I was elected at 27. And I was in the minority party because Newt Gingrich had become Speaker of the House. So suffice it to say, I was the lowest guy on the totem pole. You got the picture? And the way it works either up in Sacramento or in Washington, D.C. is you have to have a lot of gray hair or no hair at all before you get to put your name first on anything popular. Because, of course, every politician is fighting all over themselves and their colleagues to get ahead and be the first name on this popular bill and the first name on that popular bill. So it tells you a lot about mental health and addiction that the youngest member of Congress from the smallest state in the country and in the minority party got to put his name first on a bill called the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act. And it had nothing to do with the fact that because I was a Kennedy and I had been in drug treatment, that it was well known. Because the guy that I was in drug treatment with sold his story to the National Enquirer that he was my roommate in rehab. And so all of that confidentiality that I would hope that John Sharon as a psychiatrist would protect if he were my therapist, even though he sort of informally acts as a therapist to me whenever I'm out on the West Coast. All of that HIPAA privacy was gone. But it liberated me in a certain sense, because now I could sign that bill and not have to worry about the press asking me, have you ever been treated for a mental health or addiction condition? Has anyone in your family? Because you see, that was the worry that most of my colleagues had. And they had one of two choices. They could say yes, in which case there'd be 35 more questions like, how did it work out? What medications are you on? And of course, how are you? And who wants to answer those questions? And of course, the easiest answer is no. Get the hell away from me. In which case, the press would just be all over them. So this is why I had the dubious honor of being the leader of mental health and addiction, just by default. So the irony of all ironies is that, as is in the case with mental illness and addiction, I was the last one to know that I also suffered from the mental illness and addiction, even though I had been to treatment. The layers and layers and levels of denial on my own part made for a very interesting paradox that while even I was the sponsor of the national legislation saying we shouldn't discriminate against mental illness and addiction, and we should fight stigma. Whenever it came to my needing treatment, I used to tell the hospitals not to send me down to the psychiatric ward. God forbid anybody find out. I would tell them, take care of me right here in the regular hospital. Because don't you know who I am? I can't afford to get caught being the champion of mental health and also having a mental health condition. This is the big irony, right? And frankly, it wasn't until I left Congress in 2011 that I was finally able to get permanent sobriety. I am proud to say that since February 22nd, 2011, I've not had the need to drink or drug. But every time I go back to Washington, D.C., now I understand why I did drink and drug. To survive. It's not funny. I mean, I try to make light of it because we often get into such a downer when we talk about the tragedy of these illnesses and their circumstances. I would just say that I know today that there's a bigger power than me that was in control of everything when I didn't recognize it at the time. Because how in the world could it be that I could write this bill in the House that because of the tragedy of Paul Wellstone's tragic death in a plane crash, my late father, Senator Edward Kennedy, became the sponsor of this bill in the Senate, and that he and I had to negotiate about what would go in the final bill on mental health and addiction, even though neither one of us had talked about the illnesses in our family our whole lives. And we were negotiating about whether to include the very illnesses that our family suffered from. Alcoholism, addiction, post-traumatic stress disorder. God forbid anyone like my late father would have suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder after being out here in California and having to fly to Los Angeles to watch another brother die of a gunshot wound. God forbid anyone would have said to him, maybe you need some help, Ted, because no one on this earth could go through what you went through and not be affected. But no one said anything to my dad after that, like, you need to get some help. They all let him continue on in silent desperation. And as a child of his, with my brother and sister, we grew up with that. We grew up with my mother's debilitating alcoholism. We had all the nation's leading thought leaders come to our house, and my mother would shuffle through our house, and none of them would look up and make one comment about my mother because they were all in on the conspiracy of silence, hoping, like we did, that my mother would go back quietly and lock her door so she wouldn't have to embarrass us anymore by her presence. So how ironic that I had the good fortune to be part of a movement that, as Daryl said, is just starting to come of age, that will make sure that this cycle of denial does not happen again in our country for another generation of Americans. So in a real sense, we are fighting a new type of medical civil rights because we don't want mental health to be a separate and unequal treatment system. We don't want to have people, just because their illness is an illness of the brain, to have to go down and drink from the colored water fountain anymore. We don't want them to have to feel like somehow they're less than because their illness is an illness of the brain as opposed to any other illness of the body. Because it's that kind of shame that makes all of these illnesses even worse. And so what we have today, led by Dr. John Sharon, who's a doctor, is talking not only about this as a medical issue and a societal issue, but a moral issue. Because we are in the house of God. And it is important for us to come back to that age-old wisdom, no matter what house of worship you have, that you treat others as you yourself would want to be treated. And that those there, but the least of these, my brothers and sisters, go I. And that is the fundamental moral charge articulated by John F. Kennedy when he signed and spoke in front of the nation on civil rights. Because back then, they said, don't rush that civil rights. You know, who knows what's going to happen? How quickly? We can't go too quickly. It's going to take a while to integrate. And that's what we hear from these insurance companies. That's what we hear from these hospitals. They always say, oh, it's going to take time. Well, what about it when it's your child that needs one of these services? How are you going to feel then? So that's what John F. Kennedy said. He said that we ought to treat this as the moral issue. And then he ultimately, just before he passed away, signed the Community Mental Health Act of 1963. And that was the historic piece of legislation that said we ought to treat people in the most least restrictive environment, wherever possible, and that people with mental illness, as he said, need no longer be alien to our affections or beyond the help of our communities. And so, how ironic that not only did the bill I got to introduce help rectify, in a small sense, the experience that I had when I was a child growing up with a mother that was constantly being berated as if it was a moral failing of hers as opposed to a medical failing. Like she chose to be shamed like that, as if that was something voluntary that she did. And not only did I get to talk to my dad about mental health, even if it was over the legislative, table, but at least I got to finally have a conversation with him before he died. But when it ultimately was a bill that got signed into law, it was signed into law on the same desk that President Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Act of 1963. Now, you can say a lot of things, but I don't believe that's a coincidence. And so today, I try to live my life knowing that I can't control what happens. If I just try to be part of this movement that you're all part of kicking off, things are going to work out the way they're meant to work out. And I'm grateful for the fact that all of you are here today to help us make sure that we say that the march continues. Because 50 years ago, this year, not more than a couple weeks from now, will be the 50th anniversary of my Uncle Bobby's death. We just marked the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's death. We saw 1968 marked by great riots and protests and young people coming up out of the shadows through the freedom rides. Freedom rides, those young people were helping to bring desegregation throughout this country. And wouldn't it be appropriate in that historical dimension for us to say 50 years later, we're carrying on Dr. King's vision of a more beloved community because we're pairing up on a new freedom ride, and that is to liberate those brothers and sisters of ours who were enshackled by the current system of mental health and denied the treatment that they are due because of the dignity of who they are as human beings. Thank you very much.